Hello, and welcome to Positive Psychology News Daily, the video series. We are starting this video series to bring positive psychology researchers and practitioners directly to you. And we thought that the best way for us to start would be for the two editors of the website to interview each other. And in this series, I am Senia Maymin, and I am interviewing Kathryn Britton, and I'm delighted to do so. So I'm excited about the questions that I'll be asking her, and I will start by saying, hi, Kathryn.
Hey, good to be with you, Senia.
And the first question that I'd love to do, just to give us a sense of who Kathryn is and her background is, for those of us who aren't as familiar with Kathryn and her work and her writing and editing on PPND, is Kathryn, could you give us a little bit of background about you?
I'd be happy to, Senia. I have about 30 years experience as a software engineer. So I worked first for the Navy and then for IBM, developing software products, including an early version of the software that allows you to look at websites on your cell phone. It was just a little bit too early, so we weren't the really successful ones, but it was a lot of fun to develop. But one of the things I noticed, I love technology, it's a great deal of fun, but I also found that I was getting more and more interested in what goes on with people and how can we make people more successful, more happy in their environments. So I was very much attracted to the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program, which you and I both went through in 2005, 2006, and that became a turning point in my life where I shifted from thinking about technology with some thinking about people to thinking about people with a little bit of technology. So now I am involved in a number of different ways to try to increase the well-being of people in the world, from the writing and editing that I do from Positive Psychology News Daily, to coaching people both in workplaces where they're dealing with the challenges of rapid change, of trying to build their networks, of trying to develop their careers, to one of my fun projects right now is running a writer's workshop where I bring people together to give each other feedback in a very structured way that helps everybody develop confidence and become better writers. So I have a number of other things that I do, but that's probably enough to get us started for today.
And please do, with reference to the questions that I'm asking you, bring in those other things as they may be relevant.
Okay, thank you.
I'd love to ask you first about your own personal heroes in the field of positive psychology, whose work and whose effort towards bringing us research are you really excited by?
Well, I always have trouble picking favorites because there's so many people who are inspiring, but two people do pop into my mind as you ask that. The first one is Daniel Kahneman, and the second one is Jane Dutton. So about Daniel Kahneman, well, first of all, he's a hero to many psychologists because he won the Nobel Prize, and there's no Nobel Prize for psychology, so he managed to figure out how to do it by making contributions that brought him the prize in economics. But in particular, he focuses on thinking errors and ways of thinking that are sort of systematic, that people can start to understand about themselves and other people and get certain benefits about just understanding that that's the way brains tend to work. So one particular example that I actually use quite often is thinking about success. So you know how it is, somebody will go and achieve some major goal, and then they think they have the recipe for how to achieve that goal for everybody else. And so their next step is to write a book saying, well, here's how to do it. Well, what they don't necessarily take into account are all of the accidental factors that went into their success. They were at the right time, they knew the right people at the right place, etc., etc. All of those things cannot necessarily be replicated by anybody else. So a certain amount of humility about your own successes and a certain amount of skepticism about other people telling you how to succeed, I think actually makes a lot of sense.
And it's so nice because Kahneman phrases it as an error and a heuristic, so something we're doing. And really, some of those things you can only see in hindsight. Well, here's what else in the environment or the context or the other people that helped me that could have gotten me to this place.
Exactly, exactly. So I like I like the fact that it leads to a little bit of humility.
Yeah.
Another result of his that I really like is the reminding us about regression to the mean. And he does this through a wonderful story about trying to teach pilot instructors in Israel how to give feedback to pilots. And so he tells them, it's more powerful to tell people what they're doing right than what they're doing wrong. And they say, yeah, you're dead wrong. And what he finds out is that from their experience, they have a great flight with a pilot, and then they tell them what they did right, and then the next flight will be worse. And so in their minds, they're thinking, great flight, good feedback makes things worse. Similarly, if there's a terrible flight and they jump all over people, usually because of regression to the mean, people's next flight will be better. So they think, great, terrible flight, bad feedback makes things better. So this reminder that some of the variation that we experience is not necessarily due to our own efforts, and that regression to the mean actually tends to have a play in it, I think is a good reminder for the humility of our own power in interpreting what's going on.
Nice. So two aspects that both conclude at humility, basically.
Yes, yes. And I think he's somebody that has a certain amount of humility in the way he lived his life too. So that's part of what makes him a hero to me. My other hero that I want to mention today is Jane Dutton, because she studies compassion at work. And so her work for the last few years has been about how do we take a focus on having a culture of fairness at work and take that a step further and make it into a culture of caring at work. So being in both the psychology department and a business school, she's looking at this from not just the aspect of, well, how can we make people's experiences better. She's also looking at it from the point of view of what difference does it make to the businesses. So she's someone to watch in terms of the story that she tells about how compassion makes business sense. And I think that's a mission that a lot of people that I coach wish that their management chains had learned.
So you're hearing about what would have been good research to have presented to their bosses.
I guess so.
Any specific example of compassion at work that really resonates with you, either from your clients or from some of what Jane Dutton writes about, just to get a little more clarity about the concept?
Well, she uses as one of her examples John Chambers, who is the CEO of Cisco, and she says that it's a policy of his that whenever a major event happens, particularly a major illness, a major accident, or a loss happens, that he wants to be notified within 24 hours, and then he and other people around him can mobilize support for whatever is happening in the person's life. So she tells a story about a worker in Israel that had an accident. I think he was riding a bike and had an accident that put him in the hospital for a period of time. And she talks about how the company sort of started rolling out ways of supporting him and his family in order to make it possible for him to recover. And I will say that I had experiences like that at IBM, and experiences like that lead to a feeling of loyalty that is not necessarily a common thing nowadays for people in large organizations.
Thank you. That actually brings me to something else that I've been wanting to ask you, which is that in your experience as an executive coach, what is something that you find that you share as ideas with your clients, or that you use as ideas in how you do executive coaching?
Well, one of them is, I guess, a bit of a follow-on for what I was saying about Daniel Kahneman. In particular, I like the expression, you don't own the outcome. So it's a way of reminding people that you do the best you can. You try to make yourself as prepared as you can for situations, but there are so many other factors that are playing into it that you, instead of going into it thinking, oh, I'm going to succeed, I'm going to fail, instead focus on what you actually are doing yourself and then let the outcome take care of itself. And that is, I think, an idea that shows up in life in a lot of different places. I mean, it shows up, for example, for parents. You can do the best you can for your children, but you don't know how it's going to turn out because there's so many factors in genetics and other experiences, etc. So it's not all your fault if your child happens to hit a rocky patch in the road. And so to do the best you can, but to realize that you don't own the outcome is something that I found a very useful thing to live by myself. The other point, and I'm going to have two. The other point I'd like to make is to view whenever you're working towards a change, to set it up in your mind as a series of experiments, so that you're thinking in terms of okay, what might be the next best step here? Then try it and then observe. Did it work well? Did it not work well? Instead of then thinking, oh, it didn't work well, so therefore I'm a failure, I'm not really any good at changing, etc., you look at that as a source of information, as if you're a scientist about your own life. And so you can then use, it's just a better jumping off point for the next step than thinking about it in terms of success or failure, to think of it in terms of an experiment that may or may not have worked. And there may be a better way of doing it if you can just think about it some more.
And if you can, when in the case that the experiment doesn't work, what I hear you saying is if you can gather the learning from that experiment.
Exactly.
Right. And how do coaching clients respond to that framing? You've shared that with me, and I think it's a great framing. How do you find that coaching clients respond to it?
Very well. I think that and it often does turn into the case of somebody saying, well, I'm going to try this. I don't know if it'll work. And many times it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And it gives you a great platform for talking about it without, I was once taught in coach training never to put the client in the wrong. And so if you're in a position where you're having to say, well, you didn't do your job, you didn't, et cetera, you didn't do what you said you were going to do, so let me heap guilt on you. That's actually not a great platform for change. And in matter of fact, in Prochaska's book about change, he makes the point that guilt and shame are very, very poor platforms for change. So that doesn't work. But if you can have it set up so people can say, I meant to do such and such and I just couldn't get around to it, then you can say, okay, well, what was it about the experiment that didn't really work for you? Right. And so how could we set up a better experiment for the next period of time?
Right. So really focusing on it as that kind of lens, the experimental lens.
Right. Yeah, and I have to give credit to Stuart Friedman, because his book Total Leadership is what turned me on to that particular way of framing things. Super. Yeah, very clear examples. To turn a little bit to the medium in which we are doing this, we're doing this as, in a sense, PPND TV, the TV version of Positive Psychology News Daily. I want to ask you, in your experience over the past, it's been about 7 years of co-running the site, Positive Psychology News Daily, what have you found is a major benefit to the authors? We have over 100 authors, and to the readers. What are you finding that people are saying, oh, yes, this is great about PPND? Well, I think that for the authors, it's the chance, it's a platform for learning how to merge together stories and research in a way that has an impact on people who read it. So having that place to practice, having a little bit of guidance, sometimes we'll let them know, oh, you could have a little bit more research here, or you could strengthen your story a little bit here, but to be getting better and better at telling the stories that help people pull together the research ideas and put them to work in their own lives. Okay, so that for the authors, I think and it can also be a way for people to publicize their own blogs or their own programs or the books that they write. So it's a platform for getting the word out. For readers, I look at what we've managed to accumulate over 7 years. It's not just like a newspaper. You get it, you read it, you put it in the recycling. But Positive Psychology News Daily has accumulated. We're getting close to 1,200 articles about topics ranging from taking care of babies to taking care of people at the end of life, of
Mhm.
work situations, of school situations, of of honeymoons, of you know getting married and what marriage might be like, of all kinds of topics. And what's really interesting about it for me is that if you were to go look for a particular topic like motivation, you could find motivation written up by maybe 5 to 10 different people giving you slightly different angles on it. So it's a little bit like having two eyes that gives you depth perception. I think that having multiple people writing about the same topics gives a little bit of depth perception to readers who want to pursue them.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. As you're saying that, I'm reminded of somebody, a reader, who wrote to us and said, and let us know, I print out the Positive Psychology News Daily article, and I cut out a quote from that and posted on my refrigerator. This is a reader from Australia. And I just loved hearing that. I just loved hearing that she will choose what the quote is about the research or from the story from the author and use that.
Right. So, so I do have a few favorites. For some reason this just popped into my mind and I want to mention it here. One of which is an article. I mean, I'm the author, but it's actually Alan Foster's ideas. He's got 6 questions to ask when you go for a job interview. And I keep pulling this one up and giving it to my students, and basically reminding people that when you're going for an interview, yes, you're there to convince them that they want to hire you, but you're also there to figure out whether you want the job. And
Yeah.
so it makes sense to ask questions, and these are great questions. Is a great place to get started.
Great, great. I'm glad you brought that up. And with this video, we'll include the link to that
Okay.
specific article.
Okay.
I want to ask you, switching gears one more time. I very much like the work of you and Marie-Josée Char on your co-authored book, Smarts and Stamina. I think there's a ton of practicality to it. When I read it, I just thought, I can do this right away. I will try this one today. Actually, it has a little bit of that trial and error mentality to it as well. I'll try this one today. I know that I can try this one next week. I know that I can share this one with a colleague, share this one with my spouse. I would love to hear what you learned from writing Smarts and Stamina with Marie-Josée.
Well, the central idea, and I have to say this is really MJ's idea. The central idea is that sleep, food, mood, and exercise are all connected, so that successes in one make it easier to have, in managing one, make it easier to have successes in others. And so the the follow-on to that viewpoint is, don't start in places where you're particularly anxious or where you've had a lot of failures. If you want to start working on your health and you've tried 10 different diets and they've never worked for you, and instead of working on dieting and food, focus on your sleep habits, or focus on your mood habits, or exercise more, or pick something else as the starting point to jump off and make change. So don't start where you're weak and try to fix it. Try to start where you're strong and then have that extend out and help you handle the area where you're weak. I think that this comes up so often. I mean, in every kind of context, that humans get together to deal with making things better, and they almost always go for, what's the problem to be solved?
What's the direct way?
Yeah,
Right.
but the first focus is on what's the problem to be solved. And then from there, the root cause analysis and all these other things that that people will talk about. It's so, I mean, I've found myself often flipping that around to saying, okay, what's the best thing that's already going on that we could take advantage of and use as our platform for moving forward? And it usually, people find it sort of startling.
But two of my favorite things are around that concept that you mentioned. So of these 4, food, mood, sleep, and exercise, start with one that will enhance the other. And what I really love, two different concepts wise, is that the interconnectedness of them, and the fact that it's counterintuitive to start with one that just start with sleep when I really want to affect food. It's a little counterintuitive, and I really like that about it.
Oh, okay. Well, it seems to work for people. So there you have it.
And to switch gears one more time, but in a sense, in rounding out these thoughts, given you have a very, very high research focus in a lot of your work, in your executive coaching, the research that you present to coaches, obviously in Positive Psychology News Daily, in the teaching that you do, what are some of the research findings that you yourself bring to your own life?
Well, oh, I guess the one that I want to talk about today, and I always have a problem when you ask a question like that, because it's kind of like there's so many. So, and because what I'd like to focus on right now is the whole question of what people do when things go right. And so often when things go right, we just sort of say, "Oh, fine, great, great job, move on." You got to, or as one of my students said, in his annual review, his boss said to him, "Great job, keep up the good work, and here's some new things that you need to focus on." So one of the things that I find is that it takes intentional actions to actually get people to think about what's going right and to actually vocalize what's going right. So, to give the research pinnings, of course, this connects up with Shelley's work on the capitalization and active constructive responding. But rather than focus on describing how to do those things, because they're described, there's a YouTube video by Martin Seligman about doing active constructive responding. I would just like to step back and say that we need to focus on helping each other get the most out of the good things that happen to us. So when something happens that is an achievement in your life, or something maybe lucky happens to you or whatever, to spend time talking about it and thinking about it, not just to pass it by as, okay, well, that's great, now let's move on to the next. So in particular, in my writers' workshops, one of the disciplines that we follow, and this is based on a book by Richard Gabriel, which I just love, called The Writer's Workshop. But he makes the point in that book that often when people are reviewing a piece of writing, they go right for what's wrong with it, what needs to be fixed, the sentences that are clunky, the concepts that don't get across. And he says, put yourself in the shoes of the writer. If there's something in there that hasn't been marked up in red ink, is it because the reviewers ran out of red ink before they got to it? Or is it because it's good and should be kept? And so the discipline that we use in terms of how to review is to start by pointing out what is strong in the piece already. And then from there, instead of saying, and here's what's broken and needs to be fixed, you can say, what would make it even stronger? Mm-hmm. And that creates an openness to the feedback that, a lot of times when people get their work reviewed, it's really hard for them to accept the comments that people make. Mm-hmm. So this makes it easier and more, just easier for people to take in what the negative feedback that follows. But it also makes sure that they don't get rid of the good stuff in the process of dealing with the negative stuff.
Absolutely. So, a lot of what you said sounded like it was directed to the writer's workshop, or I could also in my head translate it to how you might speak to a client in terms of what's strong and what could be stronger. I'd love to flip it a little bit back onto you. When have you used that with yourself? When have you said, here is where I'm strong and here's where I can be stronger, in a way that motivated you, that made you excited about making change?
Well, I think that that starting the writer's workshop might be an example of both that and an experiment. One of the things that I found is that that I actually like working with people on their writing, but I was a little bit afraid to start it, and but having this, of coming back to myself and saying, look, over your period of 7 years working at PPND, you've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people about how you've helped them with their writing. So perhaps that's something that you could build on here and then take it a step further.
So that was the answer to where are you already strong? What are you already doing? Great. Oh, that's nice. That's actually you tied together the PPND world and the fact that we're doing this as a trial and error. In fact,
Yes,
these series of video interviews, and also to your own experience and something that you use. It sounds like regularly in terms of the writer's workshop and your own process.
right.
Nice.
But it takes reminding. You have to keep reminding yourself, look for what's strong first, because that's not the instinct that people have. So,
That's a lovely place to end on. Thank you very much, Kathryn.
thank
Look
you
for
so.
what's strong.
Look for what's strong. Thank you, Senia.